Before we begin our journey into the peaceful world of medieval history, if you enjoy this relaxing bedtime story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It truly helps me continue creating these soothing stories for you. I would also love to connect with our wonderful community, so please leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. It makes me so happy to know that people all around the world are finding peace and rest through these stories, and I love seeing how our little community spans across different time zones and places. Now, find yourself a comfortable position, somewhere you can truly relax. Feel your body settling into your bed, your couch, or wherever you have chosen to rest. Notice how your muscles begin to release their tension as you allow yourself to sink deeper into this comfortable space. Take a slow, gentle breath in through your nose, and as you exhale, feel your shoulders dropping, your jaw unclenching, and your entire body beginning to let go of the day that has passed. The soft glow of candlelight flickers gently in your mind, casting warm shadows that dance peacefully across stone walls. You can hear the distant crackling of a hearth, the gentle whisper of wind through ancient oak trees, and feel the comforting weight of soft woolen blankets surrounding you. This is your sanctuary, your place of rest, where time moves slowly and peacefully, and where the gentle stories of long ago will carry you into the most restful sleep. Our story today begins in the misty dawn of a medieval countryside, where time itself seems to move as slowly as honey dripping from a wooden spoon. The year is somewhere in the heart of the 14th century, and the world is painted in soft shades of gray and green, where morning fog clings to rolling hills like a gentle embrace. In this peaceful realm, where the most urgent matter might be the slow turning of a water wheel or the gentle lowing of cattle in distant meadows, we find ourselves drawn to a great castle that rises from the landscape like a protective giant made of weathered stone. The castle walls are thick and ancient, covered in climbing ivy that has grown there for generations, and the morning sun filters through the mist to cast long, peaceful shadows across the courtyard below. Within these walls, where the pace of life follows the ancient rhythms of sunrise and sunset, young men from noble families have come to learn the art of knighthood. But do not imagine clashing swords or thundering hooves, for in this tranquil telling, we will discover how slow and methodical, how deeply peaceful this training truly was. The process of becoming a knight was not a hurried affair, but rather a gradual transformation that took place over many years, like the slow changing of seasons, or the patient growth of an oak tree, from acorn to mighty tower of leaves and branches. These young men, some barely more than boys, would spend their days learning not just the arts of war, but the gentler skills of courtesy, service, and the quiet strength that comes from discipline and patience. The first stage of this peaceful journey began when a boy reached the tender age of 7, when he would leave his family home to serve as a page in the household of a noble lord. Picture, if you will, a small child with wide eyes and soft cheeks, dressed in simple woolen garments the color of autumn leaves, walking for the first time through the great wooden doors of the castle that would become his home. The hall beyond those doors was vast and warm, with tapestries hanging from the walls that told stories of ancient heroes and mythical beasts, their threads woven in deep blues and rich crimsons that seemed to glow in the firelight. The floors were covered with fresh rushes that rustled softly underfoot, releasing the gentle fragrance of herbs and flowers that had been scattered among them. As a page, the boy would learn the most fundamental lessons of service and humility, tasks that required patience and attention to detail rather than strength or speed. He would help serve meals in the great hall, carrying wooden bowls and clay pitchers with careful hands, learning to move quietly and gracefully among the tables where knights and nobles dined. The hall during meal times was a place of gentle conversation and soft laughter, where the sounds of eating were the comfortable clinks of spoons against bowls, the soft tearing of bread, and the gentle pour of ale from pitcher to cup. The boy would learn to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to appear at the right moment with a clean cloth or a fresh trencher, to blend into the background like a helpful spirit. In the early morning hours, when the castle was just beginning to stir and the first light of dawn was creeping through the narrow windows, the page would help his lord dress for the day. This was a slow, methodical process that required patience and care, for the clothing of a medieval noble was complex and layered. First came the soft linen undergarments, then the long woolen tunic, then perhaps a surcoat or outer garment, each piece carefully arranged and fastened with leather ties or simple buttons made of horn or wood. The boy would learn to handle these fine garments with respect, to fold them properly when they were removed, and to keep them clean and in good repair. The page would also learn to care for his lord's weapons and armor, though this too was a peaceful and meditative task. In the quiet of the armory, surrounded by the gentle scent of leather and oil, the boy would spend hours cleaning and polishing, using soft cloths and careful motions to keep the metal bright and free from rust. He would learn the names of each piece, from the simple dagger to the great sword, from the leather jerkin to the mail hauberk, and he would understand that each piece had its place and purpose, like the components of a great and complex tapestry. But perhaps the most important lessons a page learned were those of reading and writing, skills that were precious and rare in this distant time. In the scriptorium, a small chamber lined with shelves of precious books, the boy would spend quiet hours learning to form letters with a quill pen, the soft scratching of the nib against parchment creating a gentle rhythm that was almost like a lullaby. The light in the scriptorium was soft and golden, filtering through windows of thick glass that cast rainbow patterns on the wooden tables. Here, surrounded by the comfortable smell of ink and parchment, the boy would learn to read the stories of ancient heroes and saints, tales that spoke of honor and courage, of quests undertaken and obstacles overcome through patience and faith rather than force. The page would also learn the basics of music and poetry, for a knight was expected to be skilled in the gentler arts as well as the martial ones. In the evening, when the work of the day was done and the castle settled into its night-time rhythm, the boy would sit beside the great hearth in the hall, learning to play simple melodies on a wooden flute or to recite poems from memory. The music was soft and sweet, melodies that seemed to echo the peaceful countryside beyond the castle walls, songs that spoke of love and beauty, of the changing seasons and the simple joys of life. The poetry, too, was gentle, verses that painted pictures with words, that celebrated the natural world and the bonds between people. As the seasons turned slowly around the castle, like pages in an ancient book being turned by an invisible hand, the young page grew in wisdom and stature. The passage of time in this medieval world was marked not by the frantic ticking of clocks, but by the gentle progression of natural rhythms that have remained unchanged since the beginning of time. Spring would arrive with the soft greening of the fields beyond the castle walls, when wildflowers pushed through the earth with patient determination, and birds returned to build their nests in the eaves of the stone buildings. Summer brought long, lazy days, when the sun hung high in the sky like a golden coin, and the air was thick with the drowsy buzzing of bees among the herb gardens that grew within the castle courtyard. The page learned to read these natural signs as easily as he learned to read the letters in his books, understanding that there was a time for every activity under the sun. In the autumn, when the leaves turned to gold and crimson and drifted down like gentle rain, he would help gather the harvest from the castle gardens, storing away apples and roots for the long winter months ahead. The work was slow and methodical, requiring patience rather than haste, and the boy would find a deep satisfaction in the simple acts of gathering and storing, of preparing for the months of rest that lay ahead. Winter brought its own quiet pleasures, when the castle was wrapped in snow like a great white blanket, and the world outside seemed to sleep beneath a coverlet of pristine white. During these months, the page would spend more time indoors, learning the finer points of courtesy and behavior, studying the complex rules of etiquette that governed the interactions between nobles and their servants. He would learn how to bow properly, how to speak only when spoken to, how to serve at table with grace and dignity, and how to conduct himself in the presence of ladies with the proper mixture of respect and deference. As the boy grew older and his shoulders began to broaden, as his voice began to change, and his face lost the soft roundness of childhood, he would gradually be given more responsibility and more complex tasks. By the time he reached his 14th year, he would be ready to take the next step in his journey toward knighthood, ready to leave behind the simple duties of a page and embrace the more challenging role of a squire. This transition was marked by a quiet ceremony, not a grand celebration, but a simple acknowledgement of the boy's growth and readiness to take on greater responsibilities. The ceremony took place in the castle's chapel, a small stone chamber with thick walls and narrow windows that let in only a few precious rays of sunlight. The air in the chapel was cool and still, scented with incense and the faint aroma of beeswax candles that flickered gently on the altar. The boy would kneel before his lord, his head bowed in humility, while the priest spoke words of blessing and consecration. The ceremony was brief and solemn, conducted in the soft, rhythmic cadences of Latin that seemed to echo off the stone walls like a gentle prayer. As a squire, the young man would be assigned to serve a particular knight, becoming his personal attendant and learning the more advanced skills of warfare and chivalry. But even these martial arts were taught with patience and deliberation, for the medieval mind understood that true mastery came not from hurried practice, but from the slow, careful repetition of fundamental movements until they became as natural as breathing. The squire would spend hours in the castle's armory, learning to care for his knight's weapons and armor with the same meticulous attention to detail that a scribe would give to the illumination of a manuscript. The process of arming a knight was itself a ritual of almost religious significance, conducted with the same reverence that a priest might show when preparing for Mass. The squire would begin by helping his master don the soft padding that would protect his body from the chafing of metal, layers of linen and wool that were carefully arranged to provide both comfort and protection. Then would come the mail, that miraculous garment of interlocked metal rings that had been crafted by skilled armorers over many months of patient labor. Each ring had been individually forged and tested, then linked to its neighbors in a pattern that was both beautiful and functional, creating a flexible garment that could move with the knight's body while still providing protection from sword and arrow. Over the mail would go the surcoat, often decorated with the knight's heraldic device, those symbolic images that served as a kind of visual language in an age when many could not read or write. The colors and patterns of heraldry were not chosen randomly, but carried deep meaning, representing the knight's family history, his allegiances, and his personal virtues. The squire would learn to read these symbols as easily as a scholar read books, understanding the complex relationships and histories that they represented. The arming process would continue with the attachment of the various pieces of plate armor, each one carefully fitted and secured with leather straps and metal buckles. The squire's movements would be slow and methodical, checking each piece twice to ensure that it was properly fastened and that it would not come loose in the heat of battle. This was not merely a practical concern, but a matter of honor and trust, for the knight's life might depend on the care and attention that his squire gave to these details. But the squire's education extended far beyond the purely practical matters of arms and armor. He was also expected to learn the complex code of chivalry that governed the behavior of knights, a system of values that emphasized honor, courage, courtesy, and service to others. This code was not written down in any single book, but was passed down through generations of knights like a precious inheritance, taught through example and story, through the gentle correction of elders and the quiet observation of proper behavior. The squire would learn that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite fear. He would discover that honor was not something that could be won in a single moment of glory, but something that had to be earned through a lifetime of consistent behavior, through the accumulation of small acts of integrity and kindness. He would understand that courtesy was not merely a matter of good manners, but a way of showing respect for the dignity of all people, regardless of their station in life. These lessons were taught not through lectures or sermons, but through the daily example of the knights and nobles among whom the squire lived. He would observe how his master treated his servants, how he spoke to his wife and children, how he conducted himself in the presence of his lord, and how he carried himself when he thought no one was watching. The squire would learn that true nobility was not a matter of birth or wealth, but of character and behavior, and that a knight's greatest weapon was not his sword, but his integrity. The physical training of a squire was conducted with the same patience and attention to detail that characterized every other aspect of medieval life. In the castle's practice yard, a large courtyard surrounded by high walls and paved with sand to cushion falls, the squire would spend hours each day learning the basic movements of swordplay. But these were not the wild, dramatic gestures that modern imagination might suggest. Instead, they were slow, careful exercises designed to build strength, balance, and coordination through endless repetition. The squire would begin each training session with simple stretching exercises, movements designed to prepare his body for the work ahead and to prevent injury. He would stand in the center of the practice yard, his feet planted firmly on the sand, and slowly raise his arms above his head, feeling the muscles of his shoulders and back stretch and lengthen. He would bend forward at the waist, reaching toward the ground with his fingertips, then slowly straighten again, feeling the tension release from his spine. These movements were performed with the same meditative attention that a monk might give to his prayers, each gesture deliberate and mindful. When the squire was properly warmed and prepared, he would begin the actual weapons training, starting with the most basic exercises. He would practice drawing his sword from its scabbard, a movement that required both speed and control, for the blade must come free cleanly and smoothly, without catching on the leather or metal fittings. This simple action would be repeated hundreds of times, until the squire's muscles remembered the exact angle and pressure needed, until the sword seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord. The squire would then practice the fundamental cuts and thrusts that formed the foundation of medieval swordplay. These were not wild, slashing movements, but carefully controlled actions that conserved energy while maximizing effectiveness. He would practice the overhead cut, raising the sword high above his head and bringing it down in a straight line, feeling the weight of the blade as it fell and learning to control its momentum. He would practice the horizontal cut, swinging the sword across his body in a smooth arc, and the upward thrust, driving the point of the blade forward with the power of his legs and torso. Each of these movements would be practiced first slowly, with careful attention to form and balance, then gradually increased in speed as the squire's muscles developed memory and strength. The training was supervised by an experienced knight, or master-at-arms, who would watch with patient eyes for any flaw in technique, any deviation from the proper form. When corrections were needed, they were offered gently and with explanation, for the medieval mind understood that true learning came from understanding rather than blind repetition. The seasons continued their eternal dance around the castle, each one bringing its own gentle rhythm to the squire's training and education. As autumn arrived with its palette of golden and crimson leaves, the young man would find himself drawn deeper into the mysteries of horsemanship, that most essential skill of medieval knighthood. The castle's stables were a place of warmth and comfort, built of sturdy stone and timber, with thick walls that kept out the chill of winter and narrow windows that let in just enough light to see by. The air was sweet with the scent of fresh hay and leather, of oats and barley, and the gentle sounds of horses breathing and shifting in their stalls created a peaceful symphony that seemed to echo the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. The squire's introduction to horsemanship began not with dramatic mounted combat, but with the quiet, patient work of caring for the great destriers that would one day carry knights into battle. These magnificent animals, bred for strength and courage, stood as tall as a man's shoulder and possessed the gentle temperament that comes from generations of careful breeding and training. The squire would spend hours each day in their company, learning to read their moods and needs, understanding that the bond between knight and horse was one of the most sacred relationships in the medieval world. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen above the castle walls, the squire would make his way to the stables with slow, measured steps, his breath visible in the cool morning air. He would begin his work by checking on each horse, running his hands along their necks and flanks, feeling for any signs of injury or illness that might have developed during the night. This was not merely a practical task, but a form of meditation, a way of connecting with these noble beasts that required patience, gentleness, and an understanding that true communication often happened without words. The grooming of a destrier was a ritual that could take the better part of an hour, conducted with the same reverence that a priest might show when preparing the altar for Mass. The squire would begin by using a soft brush to remove any dirt or debris from the horse's coat, working in long, slow strokes that followed the natural direction of the hair. The motion was rhythmic and soothing, both for the horse and for the young man who performed it, and the squire would find his mind growing calm and peaceful as he worked, his thoughts settling into the gentle rhythm of brush against hide. After the initial brushing came the more detailed work of cleaning the horse's hooves, a task that required both skill and trust. The squire would lift each massive hoof in turn, supporting its weight, while he used a small pick to remove any stones or debris that might have become lodged in the soft frog. The horses, accustomed to this daily routine, would stand patiently while the work was done, occasionally shifting their weight, but never showing alarm or resistance. This trust was something that had to be earned through months of consistent, gentle care, and the squire understood that it was a privilege to be accepted by these magnificent preachers. The feeding of the horses was another task that required careful attention and understanding. Each animal had its own needs and preferences, and the squire learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a horse was hungry, thirsty, or simply in need of companionship. The food itself was prepared with the same care that might be given to a lord's feast, with oats and barley measured precisely, hay selected for its quality and freshness, and water drawn from the castle's deepest well to ensure its purity. As the squire grew more comfortable around the horses, he would begin the slow process of learning to ride. This was not the dramatic, charging horsemanship of battle, but the quiet, careful development of seat and balance that would eventually allow him to control a powerful destrier with the subtle pressure of his knees and the gentle touch of his hands on the reins. The first lessons took place on a gentle mare, an older horse whose patience and wisdom made her ideal for teaching nervous beginners. The squire would begin by simply sitting on the horse's back while she stood still, learning to find his balance and to feel the subtle movements of the animal beneath him. This might seem simple, but it required a kind of relaxed attention that was difficult to achieve, for the natural instinct when sitting on such a large animal was to tense up and hold on tightly. Instead, the squire had to learn to trust the horse and to allow his body to move with hers, to become part of the rhythm of her breathing and the gentle sway of her movement. When the squire had mastered the art of simply sitting on a stationary horse, he would begin the slow process of learning to stay mounted while the animal moved. The first lessons were conducted at a walk, the slowest and most gentle of the horse's gaits, and even this required careful attention and practice. The squire would have to learn to move with the horse's motion, to allow his hips to follow the rhythm of her stride, to keep his shoulders relaxed and his hands steady on the reins. These early riding lessons were conducted in the castle's practice yard, a large enclosed space where the squire could learn without the distraction of uneven ground or unexpected obstacles. The sand of the practice yard was deep and soft, providing a cushioned landing for the inevitable falls that were part of every horseman's education. The squire's instructor, usually an experienced knight or master-at-arms, would lead the horse by a long rope, controlling her speed and direction while offering gentle guidance and encouragement to the young rider. The process of learning to ride was slow and methodical, requiring not just physical skill, but also a deep understanding of the horse's nature and behavior. The squire would learn to recognize the signs that indicated when a horse was comfortable and relaxed, when she was nervous or excited, when she was tired or eager to move. He would discover that horsemanship was not about dominating the animal, but about forming a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. As the squire's skills improved, he would gradually progress to faster gaits, learning first to trot, then to canter, and finally to gallop. Each transition required new skills and new understanding. For the faster the horse moved, the more important it became for the rider to maintain his balance and control. The trot was a bouncing, rhythmic gait that required the rider to either rise and fall with the horse's movement, or to sit deep in the saddle and absorb the motion with his spine and pelvis. The canter was smoother, a rolling 3-beat gait that felt almost like flying, while the gallop was the fastest and most exciting of all, a 4-beat sprint that required complete trust between horse and rider. But even as the squire learned these more advanced skills, the emphasis remained on patience and careful progression. Each lesson built upon the previous one, and no attempt was made to rush the learning process. The medieval mind understood that true mastery came from the slow accumulation of skill and understanding, from the gradual development of muscle memory, an instinct that could only be achieved through years of consistent practice. The squire's education in horsemanship extended beyond simply learning to ride. He also had to master the complex art of mounted combat, learning to control his horse with his knees and seat, while leaving his hands free to wield sword and shield. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of medieval warfare, requiring a level of coordination and balance that took years to develop. The squire would practice riding with his reins tied to his saddle, learning to guide his horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure, while he practiced sword cuts and thrusts with his hands. The training in mounted combat began with simple exercises, such as riding past a wooden post and striking it with a sword, or picking up small objects from the ground while maintaining his seat. These exercises were repeated hundreds of times, until the movements became automatic, and the squire could perform them without conscious thought. The goal was not just to develop physical skill, but to create a kind of harmony between rider and horse that would allow them to function as a single unit in the chaos of battle. As winter settled over the castle like a soft blanket of snow, the squire's training would move indoors, where he would continue his education in the warmer chambers of the keep. The great hall, with its massive fireplace and thick tapestries, became a classroom where the young man would learn the more intellectual aspects of knighthood. He would study the great stories of chivalric romance, tales of brave knights and fair ladies, of quests undertaken for noble causes and obstacles overcome through courage and virtue. These stories were not merely entertainment, but a kind of moral education, teaching the squire about the values and ideals that should guide his behavior as a knight. He would learn about the importance of protecting the innocent, of defending the weak against the strong, of keeping his word even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so. The stories spoke of knights who faced impossible odds with courage and determination, who chose honor over personal gain, who treated their enemies with respect and their friends with loyalty. The squire would also continue his education in music and poetry, skills that were considered essential for any well-bred gentleman. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the castle settled into its night-time routine, he would sit by the great fire in the hall, practicing scales on a wooden flute or memorizing verses from the great epic poems of the age. The music was gentle and melodic, reflecting the peaceful rhythms of medieval life, while the poetry spoke of love and beauty, of the changing seasons and the eternal cycles of nature. But perhaps the most important part of the squire's winter education was his continued study of the code of chivalry, that complex system of values and behaviors that governed the conduct of knights. This code was not written down in any single book, but was passed down through generations of knights like a precious inheritance, taught through example and story, through the gentle correction of elders and the quiet observation of proper behavior. The squire would learn that a knight's greatest strength was not in his sword arm, but in his character, and that true nobility came not from birth or wealth, but from the consistent practice of virtue and honored dot as the years passed like pages. Turning slowly in an illuminated manuscript, the squire grew in both wisdom and stature, his shoulders broadening beneath his simple woolen tunic, his hands growing strong and steady from years of patient practice. The castle around him had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Every stone corridor and wooden beam as known to him as the lines upon his palm. He could walk through the great hall in complete darkness, his feet finding their way by memory and instinct, and he knew the sound of each bell that marked the hours of the day, from the gentle chime that called the household to morning prayers, to the deeper toll that signaled the end of the working day. The squire's education continued to unfold with the same gentle patience that characterized all aspects of medieval life, like a flower opening its petals to the morning sun. In the castle's library, a small chamber lined with precious books that had been copied by hand in distant monasteries, he would spend quiet hours studying the works of ancient philosophers and historians. The light in the library was soft and golden, filtered through windows of thick glass that cast dancing patterns on the wooden tables, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of parchment and leather bindings, of the beeswax that was used to seal important documents. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the squire would learn about the great kingdoms and empires of the past, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the eternal struggles between good and evil that had shaped the world since the beginning of time. He would read the works of Roman historians who told of great battles and noble sacrifices, of Greek philosophers who pondered the nature of justice and virtue, of Christian theologians who explored the mysteries of faith and redemption. Each book was a treasure more precious than gold, for books were rare and valuable in this age, and the knowledge they contained was considered a sacred trust. The squire's handwriting, which had begun as the uncertain scratches of a young page, had evolved into the clear, elegant script of an educated gentleman. He would practice his letters for hours each day, using a quill pen that had been carefully prepared from a goose feather, dipped in ink made from oak galls and iron. The process of writing was slow and meditative, requiring careful attention to the formation of each letter, to the spacing between words, to the straight lines that kept the text properly aligned on the page. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about the creation of beauty through the careful arrangement of words and letters. about the preservation of knowledge for future generations. As the squire approached his 20th year, his training began to take on a more serious and focused character, for the time was approaching when he would be ready to take the final step in his journey toward knighthood. The physical training became more intense, though still conducted with the same patience and attention to detail that had characterized his earlier education. He would spend hours each day in the practice yard, working with weapons that were now full-sized and properly weighted, learning to use them with the skill and precision that would be required of a knight. The squire's sword work had evolved far beyond the simple cuts and thrusts of his early training. He now practiced complex combinations of movements, sequences that flowed one into another like a deadly dance. He would learn to bind his opponent's blade with his own, to redirect an incoming attack while simultaneously launching a counterattack, to fight with both sword and dagger, using the two weapons together in a coordinated defense. The movements were beautiful in their precision and economy, each gesture serving a specific purpose, each transition flowing smoothly into the next. But the squire's education extended beyond the purely martial arts. He also learned the complex rituals and ceremonies that surrounded knighthood, the formal protocols that governed the behavior of knights in court and in battle. He would study the intricate rules of heraldry, learning to identify the various symbols and colors that served as a kind of visual language among the nobility. He would memorize the proper forms of address for different ranks of nobility, the correct way to bow or kneel in the presence of a lord or lady, the appropriate responses to various ceremonial situations. The squire also learned about the economic and political aspects of knighthood, for a knight was not merely a warrior, but also a landholder and administrator. He would study the complex system of feudal obligations that bound lord and vassal together, the network of duties and responsibilities that formed the backbone of medieval society. He would learn about the management of estates, about the collection of rents and taxes, about the dispensation of justice to the common people who lived on his lord's lands. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done and the castle settled into its peaceful night-time routine, the squire would often join his lord and the other knights in the great hall for what was called the evening court. This was not a formal legal proceeding, but rather a time for discussion and debate, for the sharing of news and the telling of stories. The hall would be warm and comfortable, lit by the flickering flames of torches and candles, and the conversations would flow as smoothly as the wine that was served from great wooden casks. During these evening gatherings, the squire would listen carefully to the discussions of his elders, learning about the complex political situations that affected the kingdom, about the alliances and rivalries that shaped the relationships between different noble houses. He would hear stories of great battles and famous victories, of knights who had distinguished themselves through acts of courage and honor, of the complex code of chivalry that governed the behavior of all true knights. The squire would also learn about the more practical aspects of warfare, about the logistics of moving armies across vast distances, about the challenges of supplying troops in the field, about the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance in military planning. He would discover that successful warfare required not just individual courage and skill, but also careful planning and coordination, the ability to work together with others toward a common goal. As the seasons turned and the squire's training continued, he would gradually take on more responsibility within the castle household. He might be placed in charge of a group of younger pages, teaching them the lessons that he had learned during his own years of service. He would find that teaching others helped to deepen his own understanding, that explaining the principles of swordplay or the rules of courtesy forced him to think more clearly about these subjects. The squire might also be given administrative responsibilities, helping to manage the castle's stores of food and supplies or assisting with the collection of rents from the peasants who farmed the surrounding lands. These tasks required a different kind of skill from the martial arts, calling for patience, attention to detail, and the ability to work with people from all walks of life. The squire would learn that true leadership meant serving others, that a knight's greatest honor came not from personal glory, but from the faithful discharge of his duties to those who depended on him. The final years of the squire's training were marked by a series of tests and challenges, opportunities for him to demonstrate that he had mastered the skills and absorbed the values necessary for knighthood. These tests were not formal examinations, but rather real-world situations that arose naturally in the course of castle life. The squire might be sent on a diplomatic mission to a neighboring lord, carrying messages that required both discretion and courage. He might be placed in charge of the castle's defenses during his lord's absence, responsible for the safety of all who lived within its walls. During this time, the squire would also begin to assemble the equipment that he would need as a knight. This was no simple matter, for the arms and armor of a medieval knight represented a substantial investment, equivalent to the cost of a small farm or a skilled craftsman's workshop. The squire would work closely with armorers and weaponsmiths, learning to distinguish between different qualities of steel, understanding the various techniques used in the forging of swords and the crafting of mail. The creation of a knight's armor was a slow and painstaking process, requiring months of careful work by skilled craftsmen. Each piece had to be individually fitted to the squire's body, adjusted and readjusted until it provided both protection and freedom of movement. The squire would spend hours in the armorer's workshop, standing patiently while measurements were taken and adjustments made, learning to appreciate the incredible skill and artistry that went into the creation of these masterpieces of medieval craftsmanship. The squire's sword, too, was a work of art as much as a weapon. The blade would be forged from the finest steel, heated and hammered, and folded repeatedly until it achieved the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility. The crossguard and pommel would be carefully balanced to complement the weight of the blade, and the grip would be wrapped in leather or wire to provide a secure hold even in the heat of battle. The squire would work with the swordsmith to ensure that the weapon was perfectly suited to his hand and fighting style, understanding that a knight's sword was not merely a tool but an extension of his own body, and will dot as the squire's training drew toward its conclusion. He would find himself thinking more and more about the ceremony that would mark his transition from squire to knight. This was one of the most important moments in a medieval man's life, a rite of passage that would transform him from a student into a master, from a servant into a leader. The ceremony itself was steeped in symbolism and tradition, every gesture and word carrying deep meaning that connected the new knight to the long line of warriors who had gone before him. The night before the ceremony, the squire would spend in vigil, keeping watch in the castle's chapel from sunset to sunrise. This was a time for prayer and reflection, for the squire to contemplate the vows he would take and the responsibilities he would assume. The chapel would be quiet and peaceful, lit only by the gentle glow of candles, and the squire would kneel before the altar throughout the long hours of darkness, his thoughts turning inward as he prepared himself for the transformation that would come with the dawn. The hours of the vigil passed slowly, like drops of honey falling from a wooden spoon, each moment stretching into the next with the gentle rhythm of prayer and contemplation. The squire knelt in the chapel's cool silence, his knees pressed against the smooth stone floor, his hands folded before him in an attitude of reverence and humility. The candles on the altar flickered gently in the still air, their soft light casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the scent of beeswax and incense created an atmosphere of peace and sanctity that seemed to enfold the young man like a warm blanket dot throughout the long hours of darkness. The squire's thoughts turned to the path that had brought him to this moment, to the years of patient training and gradual learning that had shaped him from a boy into a man. He remembered his first day as a page, when the castle had seemed so vast and mysterious, when every corridor held new wonders and every face was that of a stranger. He thought of the countless hours he had spent in the practice yard, learning to move with grace and precision, to control his body and his weapons with the skill of a master craftsman. He recalled the quiet moments in the library surrounded by ancient books and precious manuscripts, absorbing the wisdom of ages past. As the night wore on and the candles burned lower, the squire felt a deep sense of gratitude for all those who had guided him on his journey toward knighthood. He thought of his lord, who had accepted him into his household and treated him with the patience and kindness of a father. He remembered his instructors, the knights and masters at arms, who had shared their knowledge and experience with gentle correction and encouraging words. He thought of the servants and craftsmen who had worked alongside him, teaching him through their example that true nobility was not a matter of birth but of character and behavior. The squire also contemplated the vows he would take in the morning, the solemn promises that would bind him to a life of service and honor. He would swear to protect the innocent and defend the weak, to keep his word even when it was difficult or dangerous to do so, to conduct himself with courage and courtesy in all his dealings with others. These were not empty words or meaningless ritual, but sacred commitments that would guide his actions for the rest of his life, that would define him as a knight and as a man. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the chapel's narrow windows, the squire felt a sense of peace and readiness settling over him like a gentle cloak. The long night of vigil had prepared him for the transformation that was about to take place, had helped him to understand the weight and significance of the step he was about to take. He rose slowly from his knees, his muscles stiff from the hours of kneeling, and made his way to the altar where he would leave his sword to be blessed by the priest. The ceremony of knighthood took place in the castle's great hall, transformed for the occasion into a sacred space where heaven and earth seemed to meet. The hall was filled with nobles and knights, with servants and craftsmen, all gathered to witness the ancient ritual that would create a new member of the knightly order. The walls were hung with rich tapestries depicting scenes of chivalric, romance, and heroic deeds, and the floor was strewn with fresh rushes that released their sweet fragrance with every footstep. The squire, now dressed in a simple white tunic that symbolized his purity of intention, walked slowly down the center of the hall toward the dais, where his lord waited. Each step was deliberate and measured, for this was not a moment to be hurried, but rather to be savored and remembered. The assembled witnesses watched in respectful silence, understanding that they were participating in a ceremony that connected them to centuries of tradition and honor. When the squire reached the dais, he knelt before his lord with the same reverence that he had shown during his night of vigil. His lord, resplendent in his finest robes and bearing the sword that would be used in the ceremony, looked down at the young man with eyes that reflected both pride and solemnity. The words of the ceremony were ancient and formal, spoken in the rhythmic cadences that had been used for generations of knights, each phrase carrying the weight of tradition and the power of sacred commitment. The Lord spoke of the duties and responsibilities that came with knighthood, of the obligation to protect the innocent and serve the common good, of the need to conduct oneself with honor and courage in all circumstances. He reminded the squire that knighthood was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a burden to be carried, a sacred trust that required constant vigilance and unwavering dedication. The squire listened with bowed head, absorbing these words as he had absorbed all the lessons of his long training, understanding that they would guide him through all the challenges and decisions that lay ahead. The moment of transformation came, when the Lord raised his sword and touched it gently to the squire's shoulder, speaking the ancient words that would make him a knight. The touch was light, almost ceremonial, but it carried with it the weight of centuries, the accumulated power of all the knights who had gone before. In that instant, the squire felt something fundamental change within him, a shift in his very identity that marked his passage from one stage of life to another. As the newly made knight rose to his feet, the assembled witnesses burst into applause and cheering, their voices echoing off the stone walls of the great hall. But the sound seemed to come from a great distance, for the knight was still caught up in the profound significance of what had just occurred. He felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling on his shoulders like a mantle, and he understood that his life from this moment forward would be dedicated to the service of others and the pursuit of honor. The celebration that followed. The ceremony was a joyous affair, but one conducted with the dignity and restraint that befitted such a solemn occasion. The great hall was filled with music and laughter, with the sounds of conversation and the clinking of cups raised in toast. The newly made knight moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from friends and mentors, but his mind was already turning to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. In the days that followed, the knight would begin to establish his own household, to take on the responsibilities of land management and the administration of justice that came with his new status. He would learn to balance the competing demands of his various obligations to serve his lord faithfully while also caring for those who depended on him. The skills he had learned during his years of training would serve him well, but he would also discover that true knighthood required qualities that could not be taught through practice or instruction. The knight's daily routine would be shaped by the same principles of discipline and service that had guided his training. He would rise early each morning, spending time in prayer and reflection before beginning the work of the day. He would inspect his lands and speak with his tenants, ensuring that their needs were met and that justice was administered fairly. He would continue to practice his martial skills, understanding that a knight must always be ready to defend those who could not defend themselves. The knight would also continue his education, for learning was considered a lifelong pursuit for any true gentleman. He would study the latest developments in military tactics and strategy, learning from the experiences of other knights and the lessons of recent campaigns. He would read the works of philosophers and theologians, seeking to deepen his understanding of the moral and ethical principles that should guide his actions. He would correspond with other knights and nobles, maintaining the network of relationships that formed the backbone of medieval society. As the years passed, the knight would find himself taking on greater responsibilities within the broader community of nobles and knights. He might be called upon to serve as a judge in disputes between his peers, using his wisdom and experience to help resolve conflicts peacefully. He might be asked to lead military expeditions or to serve as an ambassador to foreign courts, representing his lord's interests with skill and diplomacy. Through all these activities, he would strive to embody the ideals of chivalry that had been instilled in him. During his long years of training, the knight's relationship with his own squires would be particularly important, for he would have the opportunity to pass on the lessons he had learned to the next generation of knights. He would treat these young men with the same patience and kindness that had been shown to him during his own training, understanding that they were not merely servants but future leaders who would carry forward the traditions of knighthood. He would share not only his technical knowledge but also his understanding of the moral and ethical dimensions of knighthood, helping them to develop the character and wisdom that would make them worthy of the trust that would be placed in them. The knight would also find time for the pursuits that brought him personal satisfaction and fulfillment. He might become a patron of the arts, supporting the work of musicians and poets who celebrated the ideals of chivalry in their creations. He might take an interest in the construction of churches or the copying of manuscripts, understanding that these activities contributed to the preservation and transmission of knowledge and faith. He might simply enjoy the quiet pleasures of family life, finding in the love of his wife and children a source of strength and inspiration that sustained him through the challenges of his public duties. As the knight aged and his hair began to turn gray, he would find himself reflecting more and more on the meaning and purpose of his life. He would look back on the choices he had made and the actions he had taken, evaluating them against the standards of honor and virtue that had been instilled in him during his youth. He would take pride in the service he had rendered to his lord and to his community, in the young men he had trained and guided, in the small contributions he had made to the great tapestry of human civilization. The knight's final years would be marked by a gradual withdrawal from the more active aspects of his duties, as younger men took on the responsibilities that had once been his. But even in retirement, he would continue to serve as a source of wisdom and counsel, sharing his experience with those who sought his guidance. He would spend more time in prayer and contemplation, preparing his soul for the journey that all mortals must eventually undertake. He would find comfort in the knowledge that he had lived according to the principles that had been taught to him, that he had honored the trust that had been placed in him, and that he had played his part in the great drama of human history. The knight's legacy would live on in the men he had trained, in the lives he had touched, in the small acts of kindness and justice that had marked his passage through the world. His story would become part of the great tradition of chivalric romance, told and retold by future generations as an example of what it meant to live a life of honor and service. And though his name might eventually be forgotten, the values he had embodied would continue to inspire others to strive for excellence, to serve others before themselves, and to find meaning and purpose in the pursuit of noble ideals. In the twilight years of his life, the knight found himself drawn more and more to the quiet spaces of contemplation that had first nurtured his soul during those long-ago days as a young page. The castle chapel, where he had spent his vigil before knighthood, became a place of daily refuge where he could sit in peaceful meditation, watching the candles flicker in their holders and feeling the gentle presence of something greater than himself. The stone walls that had once seemed so imposing now felt like the embrace of an old friend, and the silence was not empty but full of the whispered prayers of countless generations who had sought solace in this sacred space. The old knight would often walk slowly through the castle grounds in the early morning hours, when the dew still clung to the grass and the air was soft with the promise of another day. His steps were measured and unhurried, for he had learned that the true beauty of life was not in its destination, but in the gentle journey itself. He would pause beneath the ancient oak trees that grew in the castle's courtyard, their branches reaching skyward like the arms of supplicants in prayer, and he would remember the countless seasons he had watched them change from the fresh green of spring to the golden glory of autumn, from the stark beauty of winter to the hopeful awakening of another spring. The knight's evenings were often spent in the company of his books, those faithful companions that had traveled with him through all the years of his service. The library, which had once seemed so vast and mysterious to his young eyes, now felt like a comfortable sitting room where he could visit with old friends. He would read again the stories that had shaped his understanding of honor and virtue, but now he read them with the deeper comprehension that comes from having lived those principles rather than merely studied them. The words on the page seemed to glow with new meaning, illuminated by the experiences of a lifetime spent in service to others. As the knight reflected on the long arc of his life, he could see how each stage had built upon the previous one, like the careful construction of a great cathedral that takes generations to complete. His years as a page had taught him humility and service, the foundation upon which all else would be built. His time as a squire had given him the skills and knowledge necessary for knighthood, but more importantly, it had shown him the value of patience and persistent effort. His years as a knight had allowed him to put these lessons into practice, to serve his lord and his community with honor and dedication. The knight understood now that the true purpose of his training had not been to create a warrior, but to forge a man of character who could be trusted with power and responsibility. The endless hours of practice in the yard had taught him discipline and perseverance, but they had also shown him the importance of controlling his strength and using it only in service of justice. The long nights of study had filled his mind with knowledge, but they had also opened his heart to wisdom and compassion. The ceremonies and rituals of knighthood had bound him to his fellows, but they had also connected him to something eternal and unchanging. The knight's thoughts often turned to the young men who had served as his squires over the years, and he took great satisfaction in knowing that many of them had gone on to become knights themselves. carrying forward the traditions and values that had been passed down through countless generations. He had watched them grow from awkward boys into skilled warriors, from uncertain youths into confident leaders, and he knew that his own legacy would live on in their service to others. The cycle of teaching and learning, of service and leadership, would continue long after he was gone, an unbroken chain stretching back to the very origins of knighthood and forward into a future he could only imagine. In the quiet moments between sleep and waking, the knight would sometimes feel the presence of all those who had gone before him, the great knights and humble servants who had shaped the tradition of which he was now a part. He could sense their approval and their blessing, their recognition that he had honored the trust that had been placed in him so many years ago. The weight of their expectations, which had once seemed so heavy, now felt like a gentle hand upon his shoulder, guiding him toward the final stages of his earthly journey. The knight's family had grown around him like a garden tended with patient care, and he found great joy in watching his children and grandchildren as they began their own journeys through life. Some would follow in his footsteps, seeking the path of knighthood and service, while others would find their calling in different pursuits. But all would carry with them the lessons he had tried to teach through his example, the understanding that true nobility came not from birth or wealth, but from the choices one made, and the character one displayed in both triumph and adversity. Changing seasons continued their eternal dance around the castle, and the knight found deep comfort in their predictable rhythm. Spring would always follow winter, bringing new life and hope to the world. Summer would bring its abundance and warmth, a time for growth and activity. Autumn would come with its harvest and preparation, a season of gratitude and reflection. Winter would return with its quiet beauty and its invitation to rest and contemplation. In these cycles, the knight saw the pattern of his own life, the natural progression from youth to maturity to age, each stage bringing its own gifts and challenges. The knight's prayers had evolved over the years from the formal recitations of his youth to the quiet conversations of an old friend, speaking with one who had always been present. He no longer asked for victory in battle or success in his endeavors, for he had learned that true victory came from living according to one's principles regardless of the outcome. Instead, he offered gratitude for the life he had been given, for the opportunities to serve and to learn, for the love of family and friends that had sustained him through all his trials. As the knight's strength gradually diminished and his step became slower, he found himself spending more time in contemplation of the great mysteries that had always fascinated him. What was the purpose of human existence? Why were some called to serve while others were content to be served? What lay beyond the veil of death that awaited all mortals? These questions had no easy answers, but the knight found peace in the mystery itself, in the understanding that some truths were meant to be experienced rather than explained. The knight's final years were marked by a deep sense of contentment and gratitude. He had lived according to the principles that had been instilled in him during his youth, had served his lord and his community with honor and dedication, had passed on the lessons of his training to the next generation. He had experienced the full range of human emotion and experience, from the joy of victory to the sorrow of loss, from the satisfaction of duty well performed to the peace of quiet contemplation. He had played his part in the great drama of human history, and he was ready to take his place among those who had gone before. The castle that had been his home for so many years would continue to stand after he was gone, its walls sheltering new generations of pages and squires, knights and nobles. That traditions of knighthood would endure, carried forward by those who had learned from his example and the examples of countless others. The values of honor and service, of courage and compassion would continue to inspire those who sought to live lives of meaning and purpose. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the castle, in the chapel where he had kept his vigil, in the library where he had sought wisdom, in the practice yard where he had honed his skills, the knight's spirit would linger, a gentle presence offering guidance and encouragement to all who sought to follow the path of righteousness. As you listen to this story of the medieval knight and his long journey from page to squire to knight, allow yourself to feel the same sense of peace and contentment that marked his final years. Let the rhythm of his life, the patient progression from one stage to the next, the gentle acceptance of each season's gifts and challenges wash over you like a warm and comforting tide. Feel your own breathing slow and deepen, matching the peaceful cadence of his contemplative years. Allow your muscles to relax, your mind to quiet, your spirit to find the same sanctuary that the knight discovered in his hours of prayer and reflection. The knight's story is now complete, but the peace he found lives on in the quiet moments of your own life, in the gentle rhythm of your breath, in the soft beating of your heart, in the gradual release of tension from your body as you sink deeper into the comfortable embrace of sleep. Like the knight in his final years, you too can find contentment in the simple knowledge that you have done your best, that you have lived according to your principles, that you have served others with whatever gifts you have been given. Rest. Now, as the knight rested, in the certainty that tomorrow will bring new opportunities for service and growth, but tonight is for peace, for rest, for the gentle sleep that restores both body and soul. Let the story of the medieval knight carry you into dreams of ancient castles and peaceful courtyards, of gentle seasons and quiet wisdom, of a life well lived and a rest well earned. Sleep now, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the same peace and contentment that marked the knight's final years, the same sense of purpose and meaning that guided him through his long journey from youth to age. The story ends, but the peace continues, carrying you gently into the restorative embrace of sleep.